Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today we talk about sandhill cranes, a bird that has fascinated me in recent years. If you've ever run across them in nature, you'll see why. They're big, loud, and interesting birds. And I've seen a whole heck of a lot more of them lately. I turned to Kent Van Horn from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to learn more about the crane, which he's come to know in decades of working outdoors. We had a lot to talk about, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Maybe just start off with a description of, what sandhill cranes look like. Obviously, somebody can Google this and kind of get a picture, but what are some of the defining characteristics of a sandhill crane?
Sandhill cranes, first of all, love open landscapes. So they frequent open marshes and fields. So they're pretty visible, and they like that because when they are out in those open landscapes, they can see predators, they can see what's going on. So a lot of people see them, and they're tall, 3 or 4 feet tall, and so people see them out there. The sandhill cranes are gray, and they have a little red on their head, and so you'll see them standing out in agricultural fields and pastures and marshes. So they're quite visible. Not to be confused with the whooping crane, which is also a tall, long-legged, long-necked bird, but that's white. And the whooping crane is very rare. The sandhill crane is very common. But both tall, long-legged animals.
They're pretty big birds. I mean, if
Yes.
you get close to them, you've seen a crane, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
They're very tall, lanky, and then when they open their wings and begin to fly, it's quite visible, and they're big. In the air, as they're flying around, they're going to look a little bit larger than Canada geese, and probably one of the larger things you're going to see, potentially about the same size as a swan if you see those flying around.
No, anecdotally, I see a lot of more sandhill cranes around the state. Is that the case? Are there more sandhill cranes around the state now than, say, a decade ago?
Well, yeah, and I'll back up a bit for you. First of all, I'll give you sort of personally, I'm a wildlife biologist. I've been in the profession for 30 years, and I've worked from the Arctic Circle of Alaska to the Florida Keys, and I've seen sandhill cranes in all those places. And so they're really cool and adaptable birds. So when you look across North America, there's the federal government defines 6 migratory populations. So Wisconsin, we're part of the eastern population. Altogether, all the 6 migratory populations, there's about 600,000 to 700,000 sandhill cranes in North America. In the eastern population, where Wisconsin is located, there's just under 100,000 that we're counting. Now, we recognize that we don't count them all, but we do a fall count every year. And if you look at those count data, in the last 20 years, it's gone up exponentially. We used to have a few here, a few there, and they have just really skyrocketed. And so now we see them not just out in the typical marsh ag field interface, but now we see them, all the way in northern Wisconsin into the suburbs of Milwaukee and Chicago. So they've pretty much occupied every niche they can in Wisconsin at this point.
So if you haven't seen one, you're not looking. Is that
pretty much. I mean, I've seen them walking around downtown Madison here. I was just over on Fish Hatchery 2 weeks ago. And by the Dean Medical Center there's sandhill cranes walking down the street.
So what's made them so abundant? Why have they been able to, prosper so well in Wisconsin?
Well, so sandhill cranes went through a bit of a bottleneck, about 100 years ago, when as many wildlife species did, when the Europeans moved across the continent and colonized new areas of North America. Most wildlife species were viewed as abundant, and they were never going to disappear. And so we overused them. We hunted them without any regulation. We collected eggs. We did all these things. And sandhill cranes are one of those species that was knocked way down. And so after the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was established in 1916, and we began to regulate the take of migratory birds, including sandhill cranes. They slowly began to recover. And they prefer an open landscape, and so they've actually adapted now to use open landscapes that we've actually created, parks, golf courses, open subdivisions. They eat a lot of grains. So in particular, if there is an open landscape next to corn or any other agricultural grains, they love that because then they have both their safe open space and they have a food source. So they've adapted to those in the Midwest, and of course that combination is pretty abundant in Wisconsin.
Yeah, right.
And so they've done well, but they've also emerged into the more natural habitats. We have them in marshes and bogs up north, and we have them across the open prairie marsh ag landscape in central Wisconsin, and again we now have them in the suburban environments as well.
You brought up whooping cranes a little bit ago, and I know whooping cranes have there's some specific conservation efforts happening in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, why sandhill cranes have been able to, rebound from, being hunted back in the day, and whooping cranes haven't. What's different about the two different cranes that have, led to the differing numbers of them at this point in time?
Well, I think, if you spoke with three different biologists, you'd probably get three slightly different answers. But I think one of the keys is that the whooping cranes are more on the aquatic end, whereas the sandhill cranes will use the marsh habitat to nest and raise their young in the early time. And when the young are growing, they need a lot of invertebrates and more protein and things that you'll find in a marsh. But then again, the sandhill cranes prefer that sort of more open area where they can get corn and other agricultural crops. The whooping cranes are more aquatic, and they stick to the marsh and eat marsh-based food. And so obviously with those two differences, one is much more limiting than the other, habitat-wise.
Sandhill cranes have, as we noted, they've really grown in numbers, and that's led to some people potentially floating the idea of a hunt for them. What are some of the pros and cons that need to be weighed when you're considering a hunt for sandhill cranes?
Well, again, it's always important with migratory birds to step back and look at the big picture, okay? Because the birds that are here in Wisconsin are here part of the year, and then they fly somewhere else. So in the big picture, as sandhill cranes have increased, they've had attention, one, from the hunting public, two, from the agricultural community, and three, from people that like to watch them because they're large and do fun things like do breeding dances in the spring and things you get to see. So people have these three different primary interest areas. Sandhill cranes across our continent are currently hunted in 16 states, Canada and Mexico, and some that fly through North America actually breed in Siberia. So the first hunting seasons under current hunting regulations were instituted over 50 years ago in the Central Plains states. So in North America and the United States, we have a lot of experience with regulating hunting of sandhill cranes. And as we've talked about earlier, the populations continued to grow. Now on the eastern population where we live, the concept of hunting sandhill cranes is very new, whereas in states just a couple over, they've been doing it for 50 years. So socially here, it shocks some people that you could even think about doing it because they're just not used to that as part of their culture, whereas other people have grown up with it and it's not unusual. Considerations, of course, is that number one, I have eaten it. I have not hunted sandhill cranes, but they are very good table fare. They're eating grains and crops, and most animals that eat grains and crops taste good when you eat them. So there is an interest in hunting them. While we see them, here in Madison, right, when you get into a hunting situation, they're not as easily hunted as non-hunters might perceive. I know people and they basically hunt them in fields and set up decoys just like you would for Canada geese, or ducks or things like that. And they get wary and smart fairly quickly and figure out how to keep their distance from people that would be hunting them. So it's not as easy as people might perceive. So that's kind of the interest, on the hunting side. I think obviously, again, socially, because we're not used to it, because we haven't done it in Wisconsin, that shocks some people. Thing to keep in mind. So I led a team between 2006 and 2010 to write a management plan for this eastern population. The other 5 populations already had management plans, and in the east, we didn't have one. But as the population grew, we said, wow, we really need to kind of lay out collectively between the states in the eastern United States and the eastern Canadian provinces, how are we going to sort through these social issues with sandhill cranes? So we wrote the management plan, and it includes a regulated hunting opportunity based upon the annual count of the population. States can apply for a very limited number of hunting permits, which is similar to how they started it out west. So in the eastern population, the states of Kentucky and Tennessee have initiated sandhill crane hunts in the last few years. And of course, the birds they're hunting are the birds that bred in Wisconsin and Michigan and southern Ontario. So the birds that we see here in Wisconsin are already being hunted. They're just being hunted somewhere else. And again, it's under a regulated and controlled system by which we know we won't harvest more than the population can sustain.
So what's kind of you wrote that plan in 2010, it's
Correct.
Actually 2017. So what's kind of been the course of discussion about whether to actually engage in a hunt in Wisconsin? Has it taken off in the state legislature? Have, conservation groups been talking about it? Kind of what's been the course of the discussion over those years, and where are we at right now?
It's a great question. And here in Wisconsin, each state, so you have this big picture Eastern population plan that 2 states have functioned under, but each state has its own rules. So Tennessee's process of establishing a hunt is going to be different than Wisconsin's. So here in Wisconsin, because it's a quota-based hunt that needs a special permit, the legislature has to take the first action, not the Wisconsin DNR. We wait to see how they manage that discussion, and if they pass a law that says, yes, establish one, then we'll do it scientifically. There has been interest by the Wisconsin Conservation Congress, which is a volunteer-based group that puts out in the spring hearings every year in all 72 counties questions about hunting and fishing rules. And we work with them, but it's a citizen-based organization organized under statute. And so twice in the last few years, the question about do you want the state of Wisconsin to explore sandhill crane hunting has come forward in the questions, and it's passed favorably. The majority of the people voting at those hearings wanted to see a sandhill crane hunt. So that often creates discussion. They have asked me to come over a couple of times to the legislature over the last several years, and I helped them draft the language that they wanted to draft, but then it never went anywhere. It was just kind of, okay, let's see what it looks like if we have to do that. And from what they've told me, they just had bigger picture priorities than this. It just wasn't a big priority. So there's been discussion, and there has been some drafting, but there hasn't been any concrete action in the legislature.
You mentioned that you've tasted the meat. Is that the primary thing that people want to hunt them for, is the meat, or is there other reasons that people want to hunt them other than just that it's a tasty bird to eat? I mean,
so the hunting public, their motivation, of course, is often consumption. Sometimes it's sport, but those two are always combined. I mean, most of the hunting that goes on, the meat is consumed. So that's the motivation from the hunting public. I'll tell you that the agricultural community has a different idea. So right now, sandhill cranes cause significant crop damage in the state of Wisconsin, primarily in the spring. So what happens is a farmer plants corn, and when it's 1 to 3 weeks of age, it's just poking up out of the ground. And when at that stage, the cranes will enter a field, and they will grab the seedling and they'll pull it out of the ground and eat the kernel that's still there. And they will walk right down a row and just wipe out an entire row of corn, row after row. And if there's a flock of 20 of them in there, a farmer can lose half his field. In some cases, they're able to put a chemical on the corn prior to planting, which makes the corn unpalatable. From what I've heard from farmers, some places it worked really well, others it didn't. But as a gauge of the amount of impact, I talked to some folks this spring that sell the product, and they said they sold enough to treat 100,000 acres of crop. So that gives you some idea of the scope of the damage going on out there if 100,000 acres of farm fields are looking to solve a sandhill crane problem. So they would like to see them shot for other reasons, obviously. Under current federal laws, and again, cranes are migratory birds, so ultimately they're under federal law, and then state law has to function within the sideboards of federal law. So under federal law, if you're a farmer, you can get a permit to shoot a sandhill crane in the spring that's causing crop damage. So those are issued. Typically, the USDA goes out and looks at a field. If they determine that's a good control solution, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will issue a permit for that farmer to shoot sandhill cranes, and then that permit goes through the DNR for concurrence. And last year, a number of we've been issuing permits, the Fish and Wildlife Service, for years, and over 800 sandhill cranes were killed in Wisconsin last year, 2016, under these ag damage permits. If you look in the eastern population, so basically the Great Lakes breeding area, I think we were somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 sandhill cranes were shot in the spring between Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ontario for crop damage issues.
Now, not that I want to get you in trouble with the people that really love them, but as far as the, eating them and the taste of them, where were you when you get a taste of these? And have you seen them be made by chefs? I mean, what's kind of the cuisine of sandhill crane? What have you seen being around?
And again, they're like any other game bird. Okay, so and people cook them in a wide range of ways. Turkeys, geese, ducks. People harvest all these animals, and they eat them. Some people look at a sandhill crane and see it very long and gangly, and they think, "Is there any meat on this?" But you have to understand, if you held one, and you got close to it, you'd realize that actually, their breast meat and their body size is bigger than a goose, right? So I mean, there's plenty of meat there. And the opportunity that I've had was just that I was at a hunter's conference where I was speaking, and they were serving it, so I got to eat it, and it was just served by a hunter, not anybody with any specialty.
Okay. So for the people who want to go out and see these birds or view them, what are some like great places around the state that they can go, view them?
Sort of the funnest time to see them is in the spring, because in the spring, so they're arriving, between March and April, and they're establishing breeding territories in April and May. And during that period of time, they do mating dances. So the male will do these dances, and then they do these unison calls. The males and females, they do these calls back and forth to build their pair bond. So that's really cool to see. So any place where you have an open marsh habitat, again, next to a prairie or a farm field, you're probably going to see sandhill cranes. I live in northern Dane County. If you go north into Columbia County, for example, and drive around anywhere, you will see sandhill cranes in the spring.
Yeah, so that's a good spot.
Yeah,
definitely. Plenty of cornfields for them to be around.
Yeah, interspersed with marshes, which is what they're looking for. So.
No, I know not in the eastern population, but there's some really good places, and if people are willing to travel to go in like Nebraska, where you can see just 100,000, a couple 100,000 of them at certain points of the year when they're migrating. Have you ever been able to go see in sandhill cranes or other birds in those areas?
I have not been out to the Platte River. I've seen the video and the photos, but the Platte River there in Nebraska, that's where they congregate in the fall. So I was talking about sort of the spring when you get to see their behavior. If you want to see big numbers, obviously the fall migration is the time to do that. Again, out west along the Platte River in Nebraska is a very popular place where people go, and you can see tens of thousands of sandhill cranes. Here in Wisconsin, they also congregate in some places for the fall migration. I know one of the popular places is Crex Meadows up in Burnett County, up in northwest Wisconsin. And from what the staff tell me, that they can get upwards of 10,000 sandhill cranes on their property at one time. And those are birds that are coming in from northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, and staging there, and all gathering up and beginning their migration south. A little closer to where we're sitting now, they will congregate in groups along the Wisconsin River at different places, and you can see at least dozens together at those locations.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about the mating dance in the spring. Have you been able to witness that yourself out in the wild?
Yeah, so I've done spring surveys of sandhill cranes and fall surveys of sandhill cranes and things like that. So yeah, it's fun.
I mean, what was it like the first time you saw that? What were you like? What was going through your head when you got to see that for the first time?
Well, I think I'm trying to remember. I believe the first time I saw it was in Wisconsin, and then when I got to see it more extensively was when I was working in Alaska when I was younger in my career. And it's just, it's a combination of comical and graceful, I guess is what I will say, because you have this very long-legged animal with a very long neck, and then these really big wings, and they put their wings out, and they dance around, and they move their head back and forth, and so because they can make themselves float a little bit with the wings, it's graceful, but at the same time they look a little gangly, and it's a little comical. So the whole combination is interesting. But then the unison call, where they call back and forth, and then they almost sing a song together, is really intriguing about how that has all developed, and that really solidifies then, of course, that bond, because that pair. One of the important parts of the breeding behavior of sandhill cranes is that they establish these territories and come back to the same territory every year. And so then that pair gets really bonded together, and they together then protect their territory where they're going to have their nest, where they're going to raise their young, and they don't let any other cranes in there. So that pair bonding is really important for them to establish and maintain their territory.
Yeah, if you see one, you're likely going to see at least another, or at least one
Very
other
often,
one, right?
Very often, yes.
Now they migrate. Where do the ones from Wisconsin that habitate in the summer months in Wisconsin? Where do they end up? Where do they migrate to? And what time of the year do they leave the state?
So Wisconsin is again part of the eastern population. So the birds breeding across eastern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, southern Ontario, they all move in sort of a southeasterly direction. So there's some really large staging areas in, say, in Indiana, Jasper, Pulaski, where the birds that are funneling from Michigan on one side of Lake Michigan and Wisconsin on the other funnel all there, and then they move in a southeasterly direction. And as far south as they go depends somewhat on the winter. If it's a harder winter, they go further south. Some of them stay further north. But they can spend the winter anywhere from Tennessee to Florida. So kind of all, again, moving in that sort of southeasterly direction.
Now, you were mentioning before that the cranes like to come back to the same area every year. So I have two sandhill cranes that live in this lot, or I see them all the time in this lot behind my apartment. So am I seeing the same ones year after year? Is that likely the same pair?
It's very likely. One of the things about sandhill cranes is they're very long-lived. So sandhill cranes can live more than 20 years. So if you have a dominant pair that's got a safe territory that they've established, yeah, they can be there for a long time.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background. So, why did you get into doing what you do? You've been working at the DNR, I think you told me off microphone, for about 19 years, 20 years. Why get into what you were doing? Why was this something that you wanted to do?
Well, I grew up in northern Illinois and northern Wisconsin, so parts of my childhood were in both places. And so I grew up spending a fair amount of time outdoors. When I was a young guy, probably 10 years old, I was reading lots of wildlife books and joined a local Audubon chapter and began bird watching and learned a lot about birds. And then I went to Stevens Point, Wisconsin for a degree in wildlife. And that just developed my interest. I spent summers on a lake in northern Wisconsin at our cabin, fishing and enjoying the outdoors. So that all bred that that interest. And then I went on for graduate work, and I've worked, again, been very blessed to have worked from the Arctic Circle to South Florida in several different jobs in my career. I've been in the wildlife profession for about 30 years now, so I'm revealing a little bit of my age now. But I've enjoyed every part of it. I've gotten to see beautiful things. I've gotten to, be in the wilderness in Alaska and work in the Everglades. But I have to say that with all those opportunities, Wisconsin was still home. So.
And why migratory birds? Why sandhill cranes? Why the other birds that, why specifically is that what you've spent, kind of a career doing here in Wisconsin?
So going back to college, when I went in to study, my strength at the time was birds. But as I began to study, I really was turned towards sort of the waterfowl, the ducks, and the geese end of things, and some of the other marsh birds, because a lot of the management was very ecologically and community based. So most of the dollars over the last 100 years for buying and managing natural areas has come from hunters, and duck hunters are among the most prolific for donating money and protecting wetland habitat. And so what attracted to me to that was I can work with these duck hunters that have an interest in hunting ducks, but then their dollars protect habitat that benefits rails and frogs and muskrats and all kinds of things. And so that kind of really led me down that path. And then as things go in people's lives, you progress and you do a few things right, and they promote you. So now I'm a supervisor, and I supervise the person that does migratory birds, Taylor Finger, and then I supervise several other staff that do pheasants and turkeys and public lands and a variety of other aspects. So my world has gotten bigger in the last couple of years. So.
Now, you said you were telling me before that you don't necessarily spend as much time in the field anymore as you did when you were younger. But I'm wondering what kind, when you think back about, over the last 20 years, some of the experiences that you have had out in out in nature, what are some of the top moments that occur to you that you kind of always replay in your mind when you're thinking back on, the last couple of decades?
Well, I like to fish. I like to hunt. I like to bird watch. I like to go. I camped with the family when they were younger. I like to hike. So I like to do all of those things. I really enjoy being out, getting out of the sort of chaos of the human world and getting out into the peace, whether it's out on the boat early in the morning fishing or whether it's sitting in the marsh early in the morning, watching the sun come up, waiting for the ducks to start flying for duck hunting. Those kinds of experiences are very peaceful. I get to see the world from God's perspective, not in the middle of town with people hustling about. I mean, I love people, but I really enjoy those peaceful times to get out.
Now, when people find out that you work on migratory birds, you work on sandhill cranes and whooping cranes, I'm wondering, just at a cocktail party, what is the kind of the common question that people will have about sandhill cranes or whooping cranes? What's kind of the number one question that you get?
Well, so I interact with people that, of course, that spend time in the outdoors, and then sometimes interact with people that don't. And so those that do will tend to express things like you did earlier before we got on air about, wow, I see these sandhill cranes, these cranes everywhere. And then they ask, and then I say, oh yeah, I know a little bit about those. And so then they ask, well, why are there so many now? And they weren't, 20 years ago. So those are the kind of questions I get. The folks that spend less time in the outdoors, frankly, have a lot of confusion. They don't know the difference between a great blue heron, a sandhill crane, a whooping crane. And so those conversations, if the topic comes up, usually lead me down to explaining the difference between, when you see that bird off the end of the dock that's catching a fish in a lake, that's not a crane. That's a great blue heron. So usually my conversations end up going into that area. One of the things that often comes up in discussion about sandhill cranes, which are, again, hundreds of thousands in the eastern, almost 100,000, is the interaction between whooping cranes, which are very rare, and sandhill cranes that are abundant. And so whooping cranes, again, are endangered, very rare. There's a natural population out there that migrates through the plain states and nests in the wood buffalo area, national park area up in Canada, migrates through the Plains states, winters in South Texas. That's about 300 birds. Obviously, that's very rare, to have a group of species with just that few. So over the decades, there's been cooperative conservation efforts between the federal and state wildlife agencies and private organizations like the International Crane Foundation to establish captive breeding pockets. And then in order to establish another population that migrated separate from the one in the Plains states, Wisconsin was selected as a place to begin a experimental migratory population in the east. So we have close to about 100 birds now that have been raised and released in Wisconsin, and at first were taught how to migrate to the southeast, and then later were learning from themselves. And there's been some ups and downs with that. The natural breeding success was very limited, but it's beginning to improve a little bit. There were some issues in central Wisconsin where they believed maybe the black flies in the spring were disrupting the behavior of the parents enough that they weren't caring for their young. The other part of it, of course, is to remember that whooping cranes, like sandhill cranes, are long-lived. And so cranes tend to go through a teenage period. So, they get hatched, and somewhere between, say 3 and 7 years, they're kind of teenagers. So they might start fooling around, but they don't really know how to be parents. But then they're going to live to be over 20. So later on, they'll learn their parenting skills and do a little bit better. And this experimental population of whooping cranes, most of those birds are about 12 years or younger. So they're relatively young. So I'm hopeful, personally, that their ability to breed and successfully raise young will increase, and we'll be able to get whooping cranes at a higher level. I think most often they're discussed together. One, when people confuse the two and don't know there's two different ones. And two, when the discussion of hunting sandhill cranes comes up, people worry about whooping cranes. Well, the other ones are rare, so what if they get shot when you hunt sandhill cranes? So I think that's probably the biggest issue that comes up here in Wisconsin in this discussion. It's certainly a legitimate question and concern. The thing that gives me peace is to know that in the central part of the United States, we've been hunting sandhill cranes for over 50 years, where the natural population of whooping cranes migrates. And in that period of time, there's been a variety of the way they zoned the sandhill crane hunting and the way they've set the regulations. They've considered ways to avoid accidental harvest of whooping cranes. All these states, and Tennessee and Kentucky, New Leon did the same thing. They create a hunter ID test that people have to go through before they're allowed a license. And what we found is that in that 50 plus years, there's never been a case where a legally hunting sandhill crane hunter shot a whooping crane. So we've got a pretty good history. Now there have been, unfortunately, there's a variety of cases where people have shot whooping cranes, but the majority of those cases were people that were just being vandals and they weren't hunting, because they shot these whooping cranes with a rifle. And you don't hunt migratory birds with rifles, you hunt them with shot and shotguns. And so these were people that were out driving around out in the country somewhere and just were the same kind of people that shoot at, traffic signs, and then they saw a big white bird and they shot at that. And I won't say I can explain that behavior, but I will say it wasn't people out hunting migratory birds.
So what kind of odds would you give there being a sandhill crane hunt in Wisconsin in the within your lifetime here at the DNR, within the next 5-10 years? What are the odds, do you think, that it's going to happen? I mean, do you think that just the fact that the numbers are getting so high that will lead to it, or is it just something politically that's just not going to happen?
Well, my role working for a state agency is to be the servant and to do the science, right? Obviously, that includes both biological and social science. The decision rests with the legislature. So I'm not going to presuppose their course of action, whether they take this up and have that discussion or not. As we've kind of discussed already, there's 3 primary social elements out there. There's the folks that like to watch cranes and think that they're really cool. And some people still think that sandhill cranes are rare, although we've discussed how abundant they are now. We have the hunters, many of whom in Wisconsin go to North Dakota and hunt sandhill cranes and come back home and see them everywhere and say, why not here? And then we have the agricultural community that's experiencing crop damage that, would like to see the population managed. So we have those three segments that are in dialogue right now about where we go in the future. And what I encourage citizens to do is, have that dialogue with your elected officials, because they're the ones that are going to create the environment to make the future decision.
You were mentioning to me that in your non-work life, you're a pastor.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, did you develop, since you spent so much time out in nature, is that kind of where you developed a certain amount of spirituality? Is that where that came from? I'm just curious. I'm then just curious. You spent time in Alaska, which is a just pristine, beautiful place. You spent a lot of time out in Wisconsin, which we all know is a beautiful place. Did that kind of develop something within you that made you want to seek out that other aspect of life?
Well, now you're going to talk to me about things that I'll confess ahead of time sometimes trigger emotion, so I'll warn you. But clearly, more today than ever, we have a noisy world, right? We have a noisy world that we are constantly bombarded with, cell phones and images and televisions and everything. And there's really no time to have peace and think about what is beyond the media that's in my face, right? And so clearly when you take time, whether it's sitting in your backyard, in the morning with a cup of coffee, which I do every day, or it's getting out into the natural world, it gives the opportunity to kind of turn off the noise for a while. What I have learned in my walk with God is that we are created body, soul, and spirit. And the spirit inside us is that which connects with God. And however, when our body and our soul, which is our mind and our emotions, are bombarded with everything, all that noise prevents our spirit from hearing. So when we can set aside all that, it allows us to hear at a different level. And so I was 27 years old in Florida when I was had began to go back to a church I hadn't during my college years with my wife, because that at the time was the culture. That's what you do. You get married, you buy a minivan, you go to church. And so I did that, but I didn't really understand. And then I actually went on a retreat with a bunch of men from the church I was at the time. And we were standing out one evening at a lake in central Florida, watching the alligators rise. That's what you do in Florida for fun in the evening. You watch the alligators rise, and the moon was shining, and we were there, and there was a couple of men in the congregation that talked about our Lord Jesus differently than everybody else, and they talked about him in a very personal way. And so when I was with those men that night, we stood next to the lake, and they began to pray. And in that experience, with my eyes closed, there was a light from heaven that came down and touched me in a place inside that I didn't know existed, and that I now would know as my spiritual self. And at that point, I realized that God was not just a name in a book, but he was someone real.
So do you have that experience when you're, like you said, when you're able to shut down kind of the world around you, and that's nature for a lot of people? Is that when you feel closest to God, is when you're out in the nature, out by the lake, or is that where you feel the closest to him?
It's kind of like any relationship. If you have a friend and you all share something together, you share going to football games together, or you're dating and there's a favorite place you like to go have dinner with the person you're dating, things like that, right? You first develop that relationship around some common place. And so I would say, those outdoor peaceful places was the first place I began to develop that relationship, when I shut out the noise of the world and I could listen to the Spirit of God. But as with any relationship, once it develops and grows, then you can keep that relationship wherever you are. And that's how it's been with me and God, is that now that relationship that was birthed in those quiet places outdoors now can carry with me all day long, even here in a conference room in downtown Madison.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I appreciate that. I'm not necessarily a religious person, but I do have a sense of something larger when I am out in nature, when I do come across a sandhill crane in the middle of nowhere, and I get to see how beautiful that bird is, because I think they're just amazing creatures, honestly. And I do get a sense of like wonder or largeness when I'm out and I have those experiences. So I was just kind of curious if that's
and that's great. And one of the unfortunate dichotomies in our culture is that people that believe that a faith and a spiritual experience with God and science are somehow can't overlap. And I guess I'll be here as a living example of how they certainly can, because I have a master's degree in biology and I'm also a pastor. And quite frankly, I think God smiles and rejoices when scientists look into the natural world that he created and find out cool stuff. I think he's sitting there and looking down and going, the kids are having fun. They're finding something new out about the universe. And so I don't see any a conflict or dichotomy there. I think when you experience the awesomeness of the outdoors, when you're a scientist and you look into the details, when you seek God and experience, his love and his grace, you find out that there's much more than our little brains can comprehend in all those situations, right? And you develop a humility that says, you know what? We don't have it all figured out, either in the area of faith or in the area of science. We don't have it all figured out. And if you have that humble attitude, then you realize there's probably a lot more connection than we see.
Thanks to Kent for the chat. I learned a lot. The conversation went down a few roads I didn't expect, but that was great. If you'd like to send Kent an email, you can find him on the DNR website. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to hear from you. And if you'd like to see some photos of sandhill cranes that I've snapped in the last couple of years, largely at the UW-Madison Arboretum, check out the website, wispod.com. I'll post some of them there. I'd also love to hear from you on Facebook or Twitter. Let me know if you're enjoying the show and if you have any ideas for people I should talk to. And don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Cheers.